Right, let's dive straight into this explainer. We're going to unpack one of the absolute most bizarre and honestly physically altering phenomenons in the entire history of classical music. We are talking about a practice that spans centuries, produced some of the greatest superstars the world has ever seen, and was built entirely on a foundation of profound human sacrifice. Today, we're exploring the history of the castrati. To really wrap our heads around this, I want you to imagine listening to an incredibly eerie acoustic recording from right around 1902 to 1904. It's of a man named Alessandro Moreschi. If you were to hear these surviving crackly audio tracks, you'd immediately be struck by a voice that sounds remarkably high but unnervingly powerful at the same time. It doesn't sound like a standard female soprano, and it definitely doesn't sound like your typical male singer. The lower part of his voice resonates almost like a super high tenor, but then it reaches up into this completely unique upper register. He is literally our only audio link to a totally lost era. Now, back in the day, Moreschi was actually celebrated under this almost mythic nickname, the Angel of Rome, right up until he retired from the Sistine Chapel in 1913. The public absolutely revered that angelic sound, but the biological reality behind his unique voice and the voices of thousands of boys before him is a terrifying piece of medical and musical history. And to understand why this was ever done, we really have to go back to the very beginning.
So that brings us to our first chapter, Silence in the Churches.
Believe it or not, this whole baffling musical phenomenon didn't even start on the theatrical stage. It actually originated deep within the strict theology of the Christian Church. The absolute crucial turning point is this decree right here from St. Paul. You see, early Christian thinkers often identified femininity with carnal temptation and sexuality. Because of that, they actively sought to exclude women from formal worship ceremonies. This decree ultimately led the early Roman Catholic Church to completely ban women from participating in or singing in choirs. So for centuries, the Christian liturgy became a strictly male province. But as church music naturally evolved, this created a massive logistical problem.
So as polyphonic music started getting more complex, and remember that requires a super broad vocal range to hit those soaring soprano notes, the church desperately needed a solution. Driven by this need, they began borrowing the practice of using castrated singers. The tradition actually traces its roots all the way back to Byzantine eunuchs, traveled through Masoronic influences over in Spain, and finally made its way into the Italian papal chapel by the mid-16th century. In fact, papal registers from 1599 officially identify castrati joining the Sistine Chapel choir.
And this comparison right here shows exactly why the church leaned so heavily into the castrati over any other options they had. Up until this point, choir masters basically relied on two groups to hit the high notes. Prepubescent boys, whose voices were famously unreliable and, would inevitably break as they grew up, and falsettists, which were adult men essentially forcing an artificial high register. But the castrati? They offered this divine, unmatched, completely natural sweetness and a vocal range that simply didn't break or fade. For the church, they were the perfect musical solution to a theological mandate.
Moving on to part 2, the anatomy of a voice. Okay, so now that we get the theological problem and the massive musical demand, we really need to look at the clinical and frankly brutal biology behind how this sound was actually made. It's absolutely vital to understand that this was a deeply traumatic surgery performed on very young boys. Around the age of 8 or 9, right before the onset of puberty, a boy with a promising voice would literally be handed over to barber surgeons. The procedure didn't remove all the genitalia, but specifically targeted the testicles, which permanently halted their natural production of testosterone. Just this one act completely, irreversibly altered the boy's hormonal destiny and physical growth.
Just look at this breakdown. The physics of the castrato voice are literally mind-blowing. Because that testosterone was completely absent, the epiphyses, the bone joints, failed to harden like they normally would. This meant their limbs and ribs just kept growing, resulting in unusually tall men with very long limbs. But more importantly for the music, this created a massive barrel-chested lung capacity. Now combine those giant adult lungs with a larynx that never descended, which left them with child-sized, highly flexible vocal cords. They were essentially human bagpipes. Massive bellows forcing air through tiny, incredibly agile strings, which created a superhuman vocal instrument.
But, as you can probably guess, the physical and psychological toll on these men was just absolutely devastating. Beyond the obvious loss of their reproductive ability, they suffered from a complete loss of libido, hot flashes, and genital shrinkage. And as they grew older, many experienced premature aging and a profound psychological isolation, very often plunging into severe senile melancholia and depression. They were essentially trapped in androgynous bodies, living in a society that somehow managed to simultaneously worship and ostracize them. Which brings us to part 3, superstars of the stage. Now, despite the absolute tragedy of how they were created, these church singers quickly crossed over into the secular world, becoming the highest-paid international celebrities of their entire era. As opera absolutely boomed in the 17th and 18th centuries, the public became wildly obsessed with the unparalleled vocal acrobatics of the castrati. But here's the catch. Polite society was incredibly ashamed of the origins of that sound, so much so they rarely even used the word castrato in polite conversation. Instead, they leaned heavily on euphemisms like musico or eviretto, as these singers totally dominated the opera scene. It was this massive societal cognitive dissonance, right? Loving the art, but completely turning a blind eye to the mutilation that made it possible. To give you a sense of just how famous these guys were, let's look at the legendary castrato, Farinelli. This guy earned a staggering annual salary of £5,000 in England alone in 1737. That is a massive, massive fortune for the 18th century. And get this, that wasn't even his only source of income. He was raking in an extra 1,500 guineas a year just from the King of Spain. Elite castrati were incredibly wealthy, commanding the exact kind of economic power and influence that we'd associate with modern-day billionaires and A-list celebrities. I mean, these guys were the absolute rock stars of the Baroque period. In regions like the Papal States, where women were legally banned from the theatrical stage just like they were in the church, castrati stepped right in to sing the leading female roles. But in opera seria, they were also the primo uomo, the leading male heroes. The absolute greatest composers of the age, from Handel to Mozart, wrote their most complex, technically demanding vocal music specifically for the castrato voice. Their lives were just filled with intense public fascination, fierce rivalries, and nonstop court gossip. But here's the really dark side of all this fame. For every superstar like Farinelli, there were countless other boys who just never made it big. Tragically, the prospect of that extreme wealth caused desperate, impoverished parents to mutilate their young sons, basically hoping the boy would become their financial golden ticket out of poverty. And because the act itself was technically illegal and highly shameful, parents would cover it up with the most absurd lies. A famous example is the singer Domenico Mustafa. He was actually told by his own family that his condition was the result of his testicles being eaten by a wild pig. It really highlights the incredibly dark, desperate economic reality hiding right behind all that glamour.
Let's wrap things up with part 4, the final fade out.
So, you're probably wondering, how did this massive, centuries-long musical empire actually come to an end? Well, the long arc of their existence really maps a journey from full papal endorsement by Pope Sixtus V back in 1589, right on through to the 18th century when societal morals finally started to shift. By 1770, the musicologist Charles Burney noted that Italians were getting so ashamed of the practice that every city just blamed another city for doing it. As musical tastes shifted back toward natural tenors and societal values evolved, the practice actually got temporarily banned by Jacobin rule in 1796. But it really wasn't until 1903 that Pope Pius X officially ended their use in the Vatican, closing the final sanctuary for these singers, which ultimately led to the death of Alessandro Moreschi, the last castrato, in 1922. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to think back to those crackling 1904 recordings of Alessandro Moreschi one last time. We are left with this incredible legacy of some of the most beautiful, transcendent music ever composed, but it is forever tied to a genuinely brutal physical reality. It really forces us to ask, does the pursuit of a divine, unrivaled art form ever justify the ultimate human sacrifice? It's a terrifying price paid for musical perfection and, for sure, a piece of history that we should never, ever forget.